Okay, so picking up where we left off in last week's video, today I'm going to be taking a look at the Reservoir Dogs from Palisades Toys Series 2 figures. Now, this series came just a little bit later than the first series and picks up the second half of the figures in this entire collection. For the most part, those who picked up the Series 1 figures will know roughly what to expect, although there are a few little tweaks and surprises in this second wave. The packaging remains largely the same, which is good for consistency and being able to have a pretty consistent collection of action figures if you're putting them on display in their boxes. Each box is big and chunky, and on the front cover we have an image of the character which is nicely illustrated. In the background we have the name of the character sort of graffitied there, and of course we have that stencil of the characters walking towards camera. Palisades for some reason have felt the need to litter the packaging with lots of icons and logos and text, which does look a little bit busy. It looks a little bit frenetic, but overall the actual presentation of this packaging is pretty attractive. You can put this on display quite happily and it looks pretty solid. Mercifully though, the side panel is a lot simpler. We just have that Reservoir Dogs logo, which is nice and chunky there. Again, we have that stencil, and then at the bottom we have the illustrated image and a film still, and it's all done in a sort of film reel kind of style, which looks pretty good of each character. So again, you can stack these boxes up next to each other and you can have the entire collection on display with all the characters on your shelf looking pretty tidy. The back of the box has an awful lot going on. Again, we see lots of logos, lots of text, but essentially we have that image of the character at the top of the box there. We have a little bit of information about the film, which is great. We have the other characters in this lineup, so of course this time around we see Mr. White, Joe Cabot and Mr. Pink. And at the bottom there we have the Series 1 figures that are also available. Plus there's some adverts for other lines that Palisades were releasing at this time. And of course, the front of the packaging has this wonderful gatefold cover as well. So when we fold this front flap open, we have on the left-hand side a quote from this individual character, which is fantastic. And then we have a little bit of information about the history of that character. Meanwhile, on the right hand side, of course, we have another image from the front of the box there, which again, nicely illustrated, and of course, a fantastic window display showing off the figure and all his bits and pieces. This is very clean, this is nicely balanced between text and presentation, and overall, this looks really, really solid. Okay, so once the figure is liberated from its packaging, this will immediately feel very familiar to anyone who's owned any of the Series 1 figures, because of course, it is for the most part utilising the same body mould. But there are a couple of tweaks. But before we get into that, let's look at the head sculpt. Now, these head sculpts from Palisades Toys tend to range between the excellent and the not so great, and it all depends on which figure we're talking about. In the case of Tim Roth's Mr. Orange, I'd say he lies somewhere in between those two measures, because there is definitely a very strong likeness of Tim Roth here, but at the same time it just feels ever so slightly off, not quite right. And it's a shame because I think they have tried to apply some decent paint apps here. The lips, the shading around the eyes themselves, there's actually a couple of different washes running through the hair. There's a lot of attention to detail here, and it makes it look quite naturalistic, and it looks pretty decent all in all, and yet somehow it just manages to just not be quite right. And I think maybe the sculpting around the nose and in between the eyes is just a little bit too pinched. Now, I did mention a couple of tweaks, and the first one is the quality of the suit. This time around, the material feels ever so slightly thicker, giving it a much more luxurious feel. It feels a bit thicker, it feels a bit tighter, just a little bit better tailored. It just fits the figure better this time around. And as we saw last time, the shirt underneath is a nice thick cotton. It has lots of little buttons on there. It has a functioning breast pocket, which is pretty cool, and of course it has that wonderful tie as well. Plus, it also has that wonderful belt with the functioning metal belt buckle there as well, which is fantastic stuff. The other tweak for at least two of the figures in this second series is the hands. This time around, the hands are still a solid hard plastic, which definitely has its drawbacks, but they are moulded in a much healthier flesh tone plastic this time around, much better than the stark, very pale plastic we had in that Series 1. Also, you'll notice the hands are ever so slightly different. They're a slightly different grip, and on two of these figures, there is actually a ring which has been individually painted, and that ring finger is different on each finger, which is a really nice touch and nice attention to detail here. Now, all of the figures in the Series 2 wave all have the same shoes. They are a nicely moulded rubber shoe. There's not a lot of detail on them apart from the laces, but all in all, pretty nicely done. And of course, they all come with socks as well, which is a nice little detail. And of course, all the figures come with the standard Reservoir Dogs 10th anniversary stand. In terms of articulation, there shouldn't be any surprises here. They are all, for the most part, using the exact same body mold as we saw last time, so the articulation is the same as on Series 1, but I will run through it just once again in case you never saw that video. They have a ball joint in the neck, which allows the head to spin from side to side, to move forwards and backwards, and lean from side to side, which is great. There's also a swivel at the neck here as well. There's a ball joint in the shoulders, allowing the arms to kick up and out to the side. There's double jointed elbows, allowing the arm to bend right the way back and have the hand touch the head if you want, which is fantastic. There is a swivel at the lower forearm, which is great, and then there is a ball joint in the wrist, again allowing the hand to rotate 360 degrees, but also arc forwards and backwards as well on that hinge, which is lovely stuff. There's another ball joint in the chest, allowing the figure to move from side to side, to lean forwards and backwards, and lean to left to right as well, which is fantastic. So huge range of motion here, which is fantastic. There's also a complementary swivel at the waist, allowing the figure again to get a further range of motion there, moving from side to side, which is lovely stuff. There's a ball joint in the hips, allowing the legs to kick out to the side. There's also a supporting swivel at the upper thigh, and of course the legs can kick all the way forwards and they can kick all the way back. There's a double jointed knee, so again the legs can kick right the way to the back there, which is great. And then there is a swivel at the ankle, allowing the lower foot to move all the way around, rotate 360 degrees, and then there's also a hinge allowing the foot to arc forwards and backwards too. Now all of these figures come with a stack load of accessories as well. Most of them come with the same basic accessories, including a lighter, a cigarette packet, and a lit cigarette. Quite a few of them also come with a gun holster, which is pretty nice, and then there's some individual unique pieces as well to each character. So in the case of Mr. Orange, he comes with his commode story and his blue bag. So next up we have Mr. White, as played by Harvey Keitel, of course. And this figure is probably the most anticipated for me, as he is my favourite character in this film, and he's one of the most significant characters. And whilst he's not the protagonist of the film, he's the closest thing we have to a sympathetic hero. But sadly, I have to say, the sculpting on this figure is probably the most disappointing in the entire line. This is probably the weakest likeness, in my opinion. I'm not entirely sure what the reference material was for the sculptor, but they seem to have used an older photograph of Harvey Keitel rather than one based from Reservoir Dogs in 1992. They've given him a lot more lines and a lot more creases and freckles than he has in the film, which is odd. And don't get me wrong, I think there is a passing resemblance to the actor, but if anything, it feels like maybe they've been a bit overzealous in the sculpting and just given a little bit too much detail, which just doesn't look right. Things definitely improve though if we put the shades on him. This definitely looks a lot closer to what we see on screen, although the shades do look maybe a little bit too big for this head mold. It looks a lot better, so I would advise if you're putting this figure on display, make sure you put the shades on. Now, Mr. White is the other figure that has the ring on the finger, which is nice. As we can see, this is on the little finger this time around, so it's a completely different mold, which is lovely, and again, painted in there. So it's nice to see that level of authenticity and accuracy. He's also only one of 3 figures in this line that comes with a watch, which is pretty cool. Now, it is a hard plastic watch. This time his watch is gold rather than silver, as we saw with Mr. Blonde, but looks pretty good. It is obviously quite simple by today's standards, but all in all, does the job and is quite nice to have. He comes with all the standard accessories, including the cigarette packet, the lighter, etc. Of course, his shades, the watch, but he also has a couple of unique pieces. He has his comb, and he has not 1, not 2, but 3 Desert Eagles. So yeah, this is a bit of a head scratcher. Obviously, he only has 2 hands. He only actually has 2 guns in the film. So why have they given him 3? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It gets even more strange when we realise that there's other figures in this line, such as Mr. Orange or Mr. Pink. Neither of these figures come with a gun at all, and of course they both use them in the film. And adding to this misplaced weaponry, we also have the Mr. Brown figure in Series 1, which also comes with both his snub nose, which is fine, he does have that in the film, but also a Desert Eagle, which he doesn't use in the film. So it feels like, in a way, if you want all these characters to have their proper guns, you've got to buy the entire wave and distribute them accordingly. Now, one of the issues with this line is that it seems that Palisades haven't really thought through how the figures are going to hold their accessories. In the case of the cigarette, some of the figures have just enough of a groove in their lips to be able to place it in there, and it just manages to stay in place with a bit of perseverance, which is fantastic. But most of them can't. And of course they can't hold their cigarettes because there's no gap between the fingers for them to rest in there. There's just a big solid mass where they're going to slip through. And again, we can see that quite clearly with this comb from Mr. White. It's a nice little accessory, it's something he does use in the film, but he can't really hold it. You have to rely on gravity, and it just balancing just right in his grip there because it's going to slip through otherwise, it's too small. One thing they do seem to have got right though is the fact that they have given him different hands here. This slightly different left hand that will accommodate both Desert Eagles, which is really helpful. Now the right hand is definitely better suited to this. He can just about get his finger onto the trigger, which is good. The left hand not so much, but it just about gets away with it, and as I said, it looks pretty decent when you put it on display like this. Okay, and then we have probably everyone's favourite, Mr. Pink, of course, as played by Steve Buscemi. Again, this is another highly anticipated release in this line. And I'm pleased to say that this time the sculpting, the likeness is pretty strong. I think they've done a pretty decent job of this. This is immediately recognisable as Steve Buscemi, as Mr. Pink. I don't think there's any mistake in him. So I think they've done a really good job with that. Again, the paint apps are quite nice on the beard, the hair, around the eyes. They've done a pretty decent job of this all around. I think if anything, if I'm going to be critical, again, they seem to have given him a little bit too many lines or too many crow's feet around the eyes, which is overdoing it slightly, but nevertheless I think this is a pretty decent likeness all in all. Now of course Mr. Pink has the same body, costume as the other figures in this line, but one thing I did want to point out is that they seem to have returned to the Series 1 moulding when it comes to the hands, so sadly it is moulded in that very pasty, white, anemic looking plastic, which is unfortunate. Of course he comes with all the standard accessories, and he has his shades, but he also comes with a couple of unique pieces, including his coffee mug, and of course the bag of loot, which is so crucial to this film, particularly the end of the film, so really nice that he's got this. Sadly, it is just one solid plastic piece. The handles are separate, but it doesn't open up. Again, it's unfortunate, but the coffee mug doesn't really work with the sculpt of the hands. You can just about hang the mug onto his hand and let gravity do the rest, but it doesn't look very natural, it doesn't really work, it's not a solid grip unfortunately. But I have to say the shades and the bag make a huge difference to this figure, and they're such little things, but the difference is massive, and I think it looks really, really awesome when assembled like this. I mean, this looks, yeah, like it's ripped directly from the film, and I think this probably ends up being one of the best in the entire line. This looks really awesome. But this wasn't the end of the line. There was one more figure in this second series, which sadly I never picked up, and that was, of course, Joe. And Joe obviously stands out as being quite different in this collection, much like Nice Guy Eddie, because, of course, he isn't in the suit. He's a very different body mold. He has that bigger, more rotund body shape, which is very different. Now, I'm not sure if this figure wasn't an exclusive in some way, but he seems to have been a much harder one to track down, sadly. And it's very difficult to judge from a handful of photos I've seen online. I would say first impressions are that the body shape doesn't quite seem to work. He just looks a little bit too top heavy versus the rest of the proportions of the body there. The head and neck in particular seem to be just a little bit too thin and narrow, a bit too stacked. It doesn't look quite natural, quite authentic, but it might look very different in the flesh. We can see some of the quirkiness when it comes to the accessories again though, because once again he's got two guns. He has a snub nose and he has a Desert Eagle. I can't remember him using either in the film, but I might be wrong on that. But again, it does seem to be a bit overkill to have two weapons. He seems to have a lighter but no cigarette or cigarette packet, which is odd. But he does seem to have a couple of unique pieces, including what I think is script pages and an open wallet, which is pretty cool. And from what I can tell, the sculpting looks to be pretty decent. This looks like a pretty good likeness. So there you have it, there's my overview of the Series 2 figures from Palisades. Obviously, there's not a lot of surprises in here, because it is a pretty consistent collection all in all. And I have to say, I think for its time back in 2002, this is a very nice collection of figures. This is pretty high-end quality for that day and age. This definitely rivals the work that Sideshow was producing in their figures at this time, and they were a lot more affordable. They were set at a much lower price point than Sideshow at the time. So I think they did a very nice job of these figures. It still stands up as a very nice collection of figures, even by today's standards. And what's nice is that we have a pretty definitive collection. Virtually every character in the film is represented in action figure form, which is really, really cool, with just one noticeable exception, and that is, of course, poor Mr. Blue. Now, Mr. Blue only has maybe 1 or 2 scenes in the film and only a handful of lines, but he is an integral member of this group, and sadly he always seems to be omitted from action figure collections regardless of the scale. Now I don't know if it's some sort of rights issue, some sort of licensing sign off, I don't know, but he never seems to make it in for some reason, and it always feels like every collection is always missing Mr. Blue, which is a real shame if you want that complete definitive lineup for that walking shot. It always seems to have a gap there, but nevertheless, that aside, this is a really nice collection and definitely worth investing in if you're a fan of the film. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.